Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Absolutely.
You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, like it's a science.
Exactly. It feels like engineering. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, broken or not broken.
Right. It's clean, it's binary, and honestly, it is deeply comforting. We humans love things to be visible and easily categorized.
Oh, we really do.
But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment or psychological trauma or, systemic human behavior, and suddenly that X-ray machine is utterly useless.
Yeah, it doesn't work at all.
We just find ourselves staring into a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, when you are dealing with the internal mechanisms of human motivation, fear, and these deeply entrenched psychological defenses, you rarely get a clear image.
Yeah.
You get symptoms, you get reactions, and you basically have to work backward to find the disease.
And speaking of muddy waters, that brings us to the ancient text we are jumping into for today's deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really intense section today.
We do. Our mission is to extract the core, enduring wisdom, the moral insight, and the practical life application from a very specific block of text. We're looking at chapters 34 through 45 of the book of Jeremiah.
And this is such a dense, fascinating section.
It is. And we aren't just reading this as an ancient historical chronicle, right? We have a fantastic stack of sources to help us dissect this, including the biblical text itself, alongside the extensive and highly regarded classical commentaries of Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes.
Right, those commentaries really help unpack the psychology here.
Exactly, because the goal is to use this text as a mirror. We want to observe how these ancient figures handled terminal crisis, fear, authority, and then translate those psychological and moral mechanics into our own modern reality.
Well, to accurately look into that mirror, we first have to understand the geopolitical and social room these people were standing in.
Yeah, set the stage for us.
Because it is extreme. We are analyzing a society on the very brink of total systemic collapse.
Total collapse.
Yeah, we are in the final chaotic days of the kingdom of Judah. This narrative arc culminates in the Babylonian siege and the absolute devastating destruction of Jerusalem, which historians place right around 589 to 587 BC.
Wow.
And then it moves into the terrifying aftermath of that destruction.
So if we assume our audience knows the basic players here, Jeremiah the prophet, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, what we really need to focus on is the atmosphere.
The atmosphere is everything.
Because the audience Jeremiah is addressing is trapped in a pressure cooker. I mean, you have weak, vacillating leaders in the palace. You have utterly terrified citizens hoarding resources. And later you have these traumatized, rebellious survivors scrambling in the ruins. It's basically a geopolitical proxy war between Babylon and Egypt, and Judah is just the pawn about to be crushed.
And that environment of terminal pressure is the ultimate revealer of character.
Yeah, it really strips everything away.
Exactly. When the pressure is at its absolute peak, the masks come off. And one of the first human mechanisms we see exposed here is how sheer panic inevitably leads to bargaining.
Oh, that's such a human reflex.
We see this brilliantly illustrated in Jeremiah chapter 34. The Babylonian army is outside the walls of Jerusalem. They have laid siege to the city.
And the psychological terror of an ancient siege, that cannot be overstated.
No, it is a slow, agonizing suffocation of a city. Disease spreads, food runs out, and the psychological toll of knowing an invincible army is just waiting to slaughter you, it begins to break the mind.
Absolutely terrifying.
Inside the walls, King Zedekiah and the populace are in a state of absolute existential dread. And in this dread, they suddenly, conveniently remember God.
Right, they suddenly get very religious. Specifically, they remember a very ancient, highly neglected law regarding their enslaved Hebrew servants.
Yeah, a law they had ignored for a long time.
The original law dictated that a Hebrew servant could only be held for 6 years, and in the 7th year, they had to be released. This was foundational.
It was core to who they were.
The commentary of Matthew Henry makes a profound point here. He notes that this law was meant to honor the fact that God had delivered the Israelites themselves out of slavery in Egypt.
Right. It was a reminder of their own history.
Liberty was supposed to be the core pillar of their national identity. If you were a redeemed people, you did not permanently enslave your own brothers and sisters.
But they had completely ignored it, generation after generation.
Why? Just greed.
Because free labor is economically intoxicating. Worldly profit and the luxury of an enslaved workforce had entirely eclipsed their moral obligations. But now, with Nebuchadnezzar's siege ramps pressing against the city walls, they decide it is time to get right with God.
How convenient.
They think, well, we need a divine rescue, so we need to appease the divine judge. So they make a solemn national covenant to release every single Hebrew slave.
And they don't just sign a piece of paper.
No, not at all.
The way they make this vow is incredibly visceral. The text says they take a calf, cut it entirely in two, and the leaders and the people actually walk between the bloody halves of the animal.
It's an intense image.
I really want to unpack the psychology of this because to a modern listener, walking through a butchered animal sounds bizarre, but in the ancient Near East, this was the ultimate legal contract, right?
It was known as a self-maledictory oath. It is an ancient federal right.
So binding yourself to a curse, essentially.
Exactly. By physically walking between the severed pieces of the animal, they were acting out a terrifying promise. They were essentially saying to the cosmos, mate, what has happened to this calf happened to us. May we be torn limb from limb if we break the terms of this covenant. It echoes all the way back to the foundational covenants in the book of Genesis. You could not make a more binding, serious, or terrifying vow in the ancient world.
So they do this ritual.
They do. And they actually follow through. They let the servants go free.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. Looking at the socioeconomic reality of a siege, let's look at the why behind this sudden burst of morality.
Yeah, let's look at the pragmatics.
Because while they are claiming spiritual repentance, releasing slaves during a starvation siege is also highly pragmatic, isn't it?
It's very convenient, yeah.
Slaves are mouths to feed. If the city's grain silos are locked down and rationed, the wealthy elite don't want to waste their precious wheat on the servant class.
Exactly.
By freeing them, they basically say, you're on your own to find food in a starving city.
That is a brilliant and deeply cynical reading of the situation, and it perfectly aligns with human nature. The commentaries often note the dual nature of their actions. It was an outward show of pious repentance, likely driven by a mixture of superstitious terror and cold, hard economic calculus.
They are hedging their bets.
Yeah, they wanted God's favor to break the siege, but they also wanted to stop feeding their labor force.
And we know this repentance was entirely hollow because of what happens next. The narrative takes a dark, yet incredibly predictable turn.
Very predictable.
An Egyptian army, an ally of Judah, marches up from the south to challenge the Babylonians. The Babylonians hear about this approaching force, and they temporarily lift the siege of Jerusalem to go deal with the Egyptian threat.
Right, so the immediate threat vanishes. The Babylonian tents are packed up, the siege engines are rolled back, and the horizon is clear. The existential pressure is suddenly lifted. And the very second the elite of Jerusalem think they are safe, the very moment the economic reality shifts and they need laborers to harvest whatever crops are left outside the city, they turn around, hunt down the servants they just dramatically freed, and violently force them right back into slavery.
It's unbelievable. They just walked between the bloody halves of a calf, swearing a self-maledictory oath to God, and the moment the economy allowed it, they broke it.
They undid their own repentance. Completely.
And God's response to that reversal, delivered through Jeremiah, is chilling in its irony.
It really is.
God essentially says, you did not grant liberty to your brothers, therefore I proclaim a liberty for you, a liberty to the sword, to the pestilence, and to the famine.
Yeah, it's terrifying logic.
Because they treated their sacred covenant like a cheap bargaining chip, God removes his protection entirely. They swore they would be cut in pieces if they broke the vow.
And God says, the Babylonians will return, and they will hold you to your own oath.
The mechanism here is what's fascinating to me. We see this exact same pattern of behavior, this conditional, situational morality play out again a few chapters later after the city actually falls.
Right.
Let's jump to chapters 42 and 43 to show how deeply ingrained this human flaw is.
Okay, to set the scene briefly, Jerusalem is gone. It's destroyed. The Babylonians appointed a governor named Gedaliah to manage the surviving peasants left to work the land. But in a chaotic, partisan act of violence, an insurgent named Ishmael assassinates Gedaliah.
Which is a disaster.
Total disaster. Now, the remaining military captains of Judah, led by a man named Johanan, are absolutely paralyzed by fear. They know the Babylonian Empire does not take the assassination of its governors lightly.
No, they're going to retaliate.
They anticipate a massive, bloody reprisal. So Johanan and the remaining people come to the prophet Jeremiah.
They come to him asking for God's guidance. They say, should we flee down to Egypt to find political asylum, or should we stay here in the ruins of Judah?
And they make this incredibly pious, sweeping declaration. They tell Jeremiah, whether it is good or whether it is bad, we will obey the voice of the Lord.
It sounds so sincere, like the pinnacle of spiritual surrender. They are swearing to submit their survival instincts to divine wisdom.
Jeremiah accepts this. He says he will pray for them, and then he makes them wait 10 days.
10 days.
Yeah.
Just think about the psychological torture of that wait. You are anticipating an imperial army marching over the hill to slaughter you at any moment, and the man who speaks for God goes totally silent for a week and a half. It was a test of their panic.
Exactly. It forced them to sit in the tension of their fear. When Jeremiah finally returns, he gives them a highly counterintuitive answer.
Right, not what they wanted to hear.
God's message is, stay in Judah, do not go to Egypt. I will protect you from the king of Babylon. He will have mercy on you.
Wow.
But if you flee to Egypt to find safety, the very sword and famine you are running away from will chase you down and consume you there.
This is the moment of truth for Yohanan. He literally just said, whether good or bad, we will obey.
So how does he react?
When the advice contradicts his survival plan, he immediately accuses Jeremiah of being a liar.
Just immediately.
He says, God didn't send you to say this. You are just being manipulated by your scribe, Baruch, who wants us all handed over to the Babylonians to be killed.
He attacks the messenger.
And then Yohanan uses his military force to compel everyone, including the prophet Jeremiah himself, to march down into Egypt anyway.
In both of these narratives, the freeing of the slaves and the fleeing to Egypt, we're looking at the exact same systemic failure.
Conditional obedience.
Right. Conditional obedience isn't obedience at all, it's manipulation. These people were treating the moral law and divine guidance entirely as a vending machine.
Yeah, put in a dramatic vow, get out a rescue.
Exactly. When the rescue was delayed, or when the divine instruction required them to surrender their own control, they instantly abandoned the vow and attacked the messenger.
This is where I want to push this out of the ancient world and into a modern analogy, because it is so easy to judge ancient people making bloody animal sacrifices.
It really is. We think we're so much better.
But the psychological mechanism is identical to modern corporate and personal ethics. Think about a massive corporation during an economic boom. Profit margins are high, so they launch all these incredible ethical initiatives.
Oh, yeah. The PR campaign.
Right. They pledge zero carbon emissions. They donate millions to charities. They vow to only use fair trade supply chains. The PR is amazing. It's their version of walking between the calf.
That is a great comparison.
But the absolute second a recession hits or a competitor undercuts their margins, those fair trade suppliers are dropped, the charitable wing is dissolved, and they start illegally dumping waste to save a buck.
Because their ethics were never actual commitments.
Exactly. They were a luxury afforded by the environment.
That is a perfect translation. The text is revealing that situational ethics, where your morality is entirely dependent on your level of comfort or fear, completely pollutes your character. Albert Barnes touches on this when he analyzes the deceit of the people asking Jeremiah for advice. If your core commitments only hold when things are easy, or when a metaphorical sword is at your throat, you don't actually possess integrity.
You just have tactics.
Right. You only possess survival tactics.
And we do exactly what Yohanan did when it comes to seeking advice. I mean, how often do we go to a mentor, a financial advisor, or a friend asking for guidance when the reality is we have already made up our minds?
We do it constantly. We aren't looking for wisdom. We are looking for a rubber stamp.
Yes.
We want permission to do the thing our fear or ambition has already decided to do. And when that trusted advisor tells us the hard truth, no, you shouldn't take that job, it will destroy your family, or no, you shouldn't flee to Egypt, we don't reassess our plan.
We attack their credibility.
We convince ourselves they are biased or jealous or uninformed.
We call them liars, just like Yohanan called Jeremiah a liar. So the mirror this holds up to you, the listener, right now is a sharp one. When was the last time you asked for advice, but secretly you only wanted permission?
It's a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is. If you are facing a critical decision right now, and a deeply trusted voice told you the exact opposite of what your survival instinct is screaming at you to do, would you actually pause and consider it? Or would you try to discredit them to protect your own plan?
And beyond that, look at your commitments. Are they tethered to your core values, or do they fluctuate like the stock market based on the current threat level?
Right, because if your integrity shifts with the circumstances, eventually the circumstances will crush you.
And that fragility, The danger of shifting morality sets us up for a brilliant contrast that the author of Jeremiah weaves into the text.
Okay, where do we go next?
We've just analyzed the failure of shifting commitments. Now, let's look at a fascinating sociocultural study of two totally different groups within this narrative. One group held fiercely, almost stubbornly to its principles, while the other group completely doubled down on its own delusions.
All right, to explore this, we're pulling from Jeremiah chapter 35 and contrasting it with chapter 44. Let's start with chapter 35 because Jeremiah uses a group of people called the Rechabites to perform this incredible piece of performative, prophetic theater.
It's such a wild story.
Who are the Rechabites?
The Rechabites are a fascinating anomaly in this text. They were a nomadic, tribal group. They were not ethnically Israelites. They traced their lineage to the Kenites, but they had aligned themselves with the people of Judah centuries earlier.
Okay.
What made them unique was that they lived by a draconian set of rules handed down by their ancestor, a man named Jonadab, who lived nearly 300 years prior to these events.
300 years, what were the rules?
Jonadab had commanded his descendants to adhere strictly to three things. First, they were never to drink wine.
No, wine.
Second, they were never to build permanent houses or plant vineyards. And third, they were to live exclusively in tents as nomads forever.
Okay, to a modern ear, that just sounds like an extreme ascetic cult. I mean, why would an ancestor command his family to live like that for centuries?
It seems extreme, but Albert Barnes offers a really compelling sociological analysis of this in his commentary. He suggests Jonadab wasn't just being arbitrary.
He had a reason.
Yes, he instituted these rules as a survival mechanism against cultural assimilation.
Oh, interesting.
Jonadab lived during a time of immense moral and political corruption in the cities of Israel. By forcing his descendants to abstain from wine, agriculture, and permanent real estate, he was preserving the pure, rugged morality of desert life against the, effeminate, corrupting luxury of the urban centers.
So keeping them away from the rot of the city.
Exactly. Furthermore, it preserved their ultimate freedom. Think about it. If you don't own a house, a farm, or a vineyard, you are not tied to the land.
Right.
When an invading army comes or a corrupt king demands exorbitant taxes, you just pack up your tent and move. You cannot be easily conquered or corrupted if you own nothing the empire wants.
That makes profound strategic sense. So in chapter 35, the Babylonian army is ravaging the countryside, and the Rechabites are forced to temporarily seek refuge inside the walled city of Jerusalem just to survive.
Just for shelter, yeah.
While they're there, God tells Jeremiah to do something highly provocative. Jeremiah brings the leaders of the Rechabite tribe into one of the side chambers of the great temple in Jerusalem.
In the temple itself.
Right. He sets out large bowls full of wine and cups, and with the full, recognized authority of a national prophet, he commands them, drink wine.
It is a deliberate high-pressure test.
Very high pressure.
He is tempting them in a sacred space, utilizing his religious authority, and their response is immediate and unyielding.
They say no.
They flatly refuse. They say, "We will drink no wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us." They recount their entire history, explaining that for hundreds of years, their people have flawlessly obeyed this ancestral mandate. They explain that the only reason they are even inside a city wall right now is sheer military pragmatism fleeing the Chaldean army, but they refuse to compromise their core behavioral vows.
And Jeremiah then turns around, walks out to the men of Judah, and uses the Rechabites as an absolute hammer of conviction.
He does.
He says, look at these people. They obey the arbitrary rules of a dead earthly ancestor for hundreds of years. But the Lord of hosts, the eternal God, has spoken to you generation after generation, sending prophets early and late, pleading with you to turn from evil, and you completely ignore him.
It is a devastating juxtaposition.
It really is.
Matthew Henry points out the layers of irony here. The Rechabites had one single lawgiver. Judah had a continuous succession of divine messengers. The Rechabites were faithful to the commands of an earthly father who was dead and could no longer enforce his rules. Judah was treacherous to a heavenly father who was living, present, and actively demonstrating his power.
That's a sharp contrast.
And the Rechabites maintained discipline over things that were merely cultural preferences, wine and houses. Judah couldn't even maintain discipline over ultimate moral laws like justice, idolatry, and human rights.
Now, hold that image of the disciplined Rechabites in your mind, and let's jump over to the other side of this contrast in chapter 44. Let's look at the people who possessed no discipline and entirely rewrote reality to justify their failures.
The Egyptian exiles.
Right. These are the Jews who forced Jeremiah to go with them down into Egypt after Jerusalem was destroyed.
Right. They are now refugees living in Egyptian cities like Pathros and Tahpanhes.
And you would think that after watching their entire civilization burn to the ground exactly as the prophets had warned because of their idolatry and injustice, they would have experienced a profound awakening.
You'd hope so.
But what do we find them doing in Egypt? They are continuing to publicly worship pagan idols.
Specifically, they are burning incense and pouring out drink offerings to a deity known as the Queen of Heaven, which was likely a reference to the Assyrian Babylonian goddess Ishtar or a Canaanite equivalent like Astarte.
And Jeremiah confronts them. He points out the absolute insanity of what they are doing. He says, "You saw with your own eyes what happened to Jerusalem because of this exact behavior. Why are you provoking another disaster?"
And their response to him is, honestly, a masterclass in psychological denial and cognitive dissonance.
It's wild. The women who appear to have been the primary drivers of this specific domestic cult step forward and boldly address the prophet.
The sheer arrogance of their reply is breathtaking. They tell Jeremiah to his face, "We will not listen to the word you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. We are going to keep burning incense to the Queen of Heaven, just like we used to do, and our fathers, our kings, and our princes did in the cities of Judah."
And listen to their reasoning here.
Yeah, they say, because back then when we worshipped her, we had plenty of food, we were prosperous, and we saw no disaster. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven, we have lacked everything, and we have been consumed by the sword and famine.
It is a complete and total rewriting of their own history.
Entirely.
They constructed a completely false narrative of cause and effect.
It is the ultimate manifestation of confirmation bias. They desired to worship the Queen of Heaven because it was culturally comfortable and demanded no moral accountability, unlike the God of Israel. So they cherry-picked their historical data to justify it.
They twisted the facts.
They correlated the material prosperity that Judah experienced decades earlier during the reigns of deeply wicked kings like Manasseh with their idolatry. They literally believed the idol was the source of their past economic boom.
And they completely ignored the fact that during that so-called prosperous time, their society was rotting from the inside out with systemic injustice, the exploitation of the poor, and the sacrifice of children.
Yeah.
They blamed their current misery, the Babylonian destruction, on the brief, fleeting moments of religious reform that King Josiah had tried to implement shortly before the collapse. They thought, we stopped worshiping the idol, and then the Babylonians came. Ergo, the idol was protecting us.
This is where we need to exercise immense wisdom and discernment in how we apply this.
Yes, definitely.
Looking at these two groups, the ascetic Rechabites in their tents and the delusional exiles, worshiping the Queen of Heaven, we have to be careful not to draw the wrong conclusion.
Right.
The enduring wisdom of this text is not an instruction for the modern listener to go sell their house, move into a yurt, and take a vow of absolute sobriety.
Right. Jonadab's rules were highly specific to his tribal context and historical moment.
Precisely. The enduring principle we are meant to extract from the Rechabites is not the content of their rules, but the consistency, discipline, and unwavering integrity with which they held them. They had defined a standard for themselves, and they did not compromise it, even when the broader culture was drowning in luxury, and even when a figure of supreme religious authority, Jeremiah, offered them an out.
And the massive obstacle to growth that the text exposes in the Egyptian exiles is how terrifyingly easy it is for us to construct a false narrative that justifies our own toxic habits.
It's so easy.
It is so much easier to blame external factors or to double down on destructive behavior by claiming, hey, this method worked for me in the past.
We see this in modern post-truth culture everywhere. Let's look at how we define success. Just like the exiles in Egypt, we constantly correlate material or professional success with being right or virtuous.
Give me an example of that.
Consider a toxic corporate environment.
Yeah.
A startup might achieve massive unicorn-level financial success for a 5-year stretch, while simultaneously fostering a culture of severe burnout, psychological abuse of employees, and cutting massive ethical corners.
Unfortunately.
Right. The leadership correlates their financial boom with their ruthless behavior. This aggressive, cutthroat culture is how you win, they declare.
Mm-hmm.
When the company eventually implodes, when they are hit with massive lawsuits or all their top talent flees and they face bankruptcy, how do they react?
They blame the wrong thing.
Instead of realizing that the toxic culture was a cancer that finally killed the host, the leadership often rewrites the narrative. They say, We failed because we went soft. We tried to care too much about work-life balance at the end. We need to go back to being ruthless. That's when we made money.
Wow. They completely misread the data to justify their lack of ethics. They evaluate their behavior entirely based on short-term material outcomes.
Exactly like the people in Egypt.
This ancient text brutally challenges that metric. It demands that we evaluate our lives, our businesses, and our leadership by objective truths and core moral values, not just by what is currently profitable or comfortable.
Because the harsh reality is, you can be doing the exact wrong thing and experience a season of profound prosperity. And conversely, you can be doing the exact right thing, like Jeremiah speaking the truth, and end up thrown into a freezing, muddy dungeon. Outcomes are a terrible, unreliable metric for morality.
So if we translate this into a practical framework for our daily lives, it requires an audit of our own internal narratives.
It does.
The application here is twofold. First, what is your modern equivalent of a Rechabite rule? You need to proactively identify at least one core ethical principle, one absolute boundary in your life or profession that you will categorically refuse to compromise.
And it has to be defined before the pressure hits.
It could be a professional boundary, like, I will never manipulate data on a report to please a shareholder, even if it costs me the promotion.
Or a personal boundary.
Yeah.
I will never sacrifice my integrity and my marriage for a momentary thrill, no matter how disconnected we feel. It is drawing a line in the sand.
Yes. Define that boundary with absolute clarity. And the second part of the application is vigilance against your own capacity for delusion.
Which is huge.
When you fail, or when your life hits a wall, pay close attention to the story you tell yourself about why it happened. Do not be like the exiles in Egypt, looking for a way to blame your positive reforms or your healthy habits for your current stress.
Right. When things go wrong, have the courage to own the failure without rewriting history to justify your preferred vices.
Now, if the common people were this easily swayed by panic and this prone to delusion, surely the educated leaders, the kings who had access to all the advisors and the texts, provided a moral anchor, right?
You would hope.
Let's transition from the behavior of the masses and look at the palace. How does power handle the truth when the truth is uncomfortable? This brings us to a deep dive into chapters 36, 37, and 38, where we witness the catastrophic cost of cowardice and the danger of speaking truth to power.
In these chapters, we are given incredibly detailed, almost cinematic accounts of two different kings of Judah, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah.
Two very different men.
Very different. They represent two entirely different psychological responses to being confronted with undeniable, painful realities. Let's start with chapter 36. And the infamous story of King Jehoiakim and his penknife.
This scene is one of the most vivid in the entire ancient text. Let's set the stage.
Okay.
It is the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign. The geopolitical situation is deteriorating rapidly. God gives Jeremiah a monumental task. He commands the prophet to take a scroll and write down every single prophecy, every warning of judgment, and every plea for repentance he has spoken over the last 2 decades.
It's a massive record.
It is. And the stated divine goal is actually one of profound mercy. God says that perhaps if the people hear the culmination of all these warnings read aloud at once, they will finally recognize the cliff they're walking toward, and they will turn back, and he will forgive them.
Because Jeremiah is politically persona non grata at this point. I mean, he is physically restricted from entering the temple precincts. He dictates these decades of prophecies to his trusted scribe, Baruch.
Baruch writes it all down on a massive scroll. And then on a national day of fasting, when the city is crowded with people seeking divine help, Baruch goes to the temple and reads the scroll publicly.
The princes, who are the high-ranking government officials and cabinet members, hear about this public reading. They summon Baruch and ask him to read the scroll to them in a private chamber.
And when they hear the sheer weight of the warnings, the text says they look at one another in fear. They aren't dismissive. They are terrified because they recognize the truth of it.
They know it's real.
They know King Jehoiakim's volatile, violent temper, so they advise Baruch and Jeremiah to go into hiding immediately. Then they take the scroll to the king.
And here's where the cinematic details really matter. It is the 9th month of the Jewish calendar, which corresponds to late November or December. It is cold. King Jehoiakim is sitting in his winter apartments, and there is a brazier, a fire pot, burning right in front of him to keep the room warm. A court official named Jehudi stands before the king and begins to read the scroll aloud.
And the reaction of the king is just chilling in its calculated arrogance. As Jehudi reads, Jehoiakim doesn't yell. He doesn't throw a tantrum.
No, it's very methodical.
After Jehudi reads 3 or 4 columns of the text, the king calmly reaches out, takes a scribe's sharp penknife, slices that section off the scroll, and drops it into the fire burning in the brazier.
That's darned it.
And he just keeps doing this. Jehudi reads another section, the king slices it off and burns it. He does this methodically until the entire massive scroll is completely consumed by the flames.
Matthew Henry's commentary focuses heavily on the sheer staggering arrogance in this act. Henry points out that 3 of the princes present actually pleaded with the king not to burn the scroll, but he completely ignored them.
He didn't care.
By burning the scroll, Jehoiakim was not just rejecting the message, he was attempting to physically destroy the authority of the divine. He was acting as the ultimate editor of reality.
Yes, that's exactly it.
He believed that because he sat on the throne, he had the power to incinerate the truth. After he burns it, he immediately orders his secret police to hunt down and arrest Jeremiah and Baruch. But the text notes that God kept them hidden.
This behavior is so recognizable. Jehoiakim taking a knife to that scroll, it is the ancient equivalent of a CEO getting a devastating internal audit report showing massive systemic fraud in his company. And his response is to run the report through a paper shredder, delete the digital files, and fire the auditor.
Just erase the data.
Genuinely believing that by destroying the documentation, he has fixed the company's financial crisis. It is magical thinking at the highest level of leadership. If I eliminate the words that describe the reality ceases to exist.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the arrogance of power. He believed that his control over the palace equated to control over the geopolitical forces massing against him.
But look at the futility of it.
Right. What is God's response to the burning of the scroll?
God simply commands Jeremiah to get another blank scroll, dictate all the exact same words again, and then add an addendum, a specific, horrific prophecy of doom aimed directly at Jehoiakim and his lineage for his defiance.
The truth remains the truth, regardless of how many times you try to set it on fire.
Now let's contrast Jehoiakim's arrogant defiance with the next king, Zedekiah, whose story unfolds during the final agonizing months of the siege in chapters 37 and 38.
Zedekiah is entirely different.
Zedekiah's psychological reaction to the truth is completely different from Jehoiakim's, but the outcome is equally disastrous.
Zedekiah is a fascinating psychological study. Unlike Jehoiakim, who wanted to destroy the prophet, Zedekiah actually believes Jeremiah.
He knows it's the truth.
He knows deep down that Jeremiah is speaking the truth. We see Zedekiah repeatedly, secretly sending messengers to Jeremiah asking for prayer. He secretly pulls Jeremiah out of prison and brings him into the palace for covert consultations. He desperately wants to know what God is saying.
He wants the truth, but his actions are completely divorced from his beliefs.
Entirely. Jeremiah's message never wavers.
Yeah.
The only way your people survive is if you surrender to the Babylonians. If you continue this futile resistance, the city will be burned and you will be destroyed.
But his cabinet doesn't want to hear that.
No. The princes, the fiercely nationalistic pro-war faction within Zedekiah's cabinet absolutely despise this message. They view Jeremiah as a traitor who is intentionally demoralizing the defending troops. So these powerful officials go to King Zedekiah and demand that Jeremiah be executed for treason.
And Zedekiah is the absolute monarch. He has the power of life and death. He knows Jeremiah is an innocent prophet. So what does he say to this bloodthirsty cabinet?
He utters one of the most pathetic sentences in the entire text. He says to his own subordinates, "Behold, he is in your hand, for the king can do nothing against you."
What a cop-out.
He completely abdicates his authority. He throws an innocent man to the wolves because he is entirely paralyzed by the fear of his own cabinet.
He is a coward, a pure, unadulterated coward. And the result of his cowardice is horrific.
It is.
The princes take Jeremiah, but instead of a swift execution, they throw him into a dungeon. And it's not a standard cell. It is a modified cistern, an underground water storage pit in the courtyard of the guard.
Right.
The text specifically notes there was no water in it, only a deep, thick layer of mud. They lower the prophet down with ropes, and he sinks deep into the freezing mire. They abandon him there, in the pitch black, to die a slow, agonizing death from starvation and hypothermia.
The contrast is vital. Jehoiakim tried to burn the truth. Zedekiah tried to bury it in the mud, not out of malice, but out of weakness.
Yeah.
In a later secret conversation, Zedekiah explicitly confesses his underlying motivation to Jeremiah. He admits, "I'm afraid."
Just flat out admits it.
He tells Jeremiah he is terrified that if he surrenders, the Jews who have already defected to Babylon will torture him or mock him.
Wow.
Zedekiah is a man who possesses total moral clarity. He knows exactly what the right thing to do is, but he is absolutely held hostage by the fear of what his peers and his enemies will think of him. He is a captive to public opinion.
But right in the middle of this systemic failure of leadership, while the king is cowering in his chambers and the princes are murdering a prophet, we are introduced to one of the most remarkable unsung heroes in the entire biblical narrative, a man named Ebedmelech.
Ebedmelech is a masterpiece of historical irony.
Tell us about him.
He is an Ethiopian. He is a eunuch serving in the king's household. In the social hierarchy of ancient Judah, he is an ultimate outsider.
Okay.
He is a foreigner, he is physically marginalized, and he holds no formal political power whatsoever.
But when he hears about what the powerful princes have done to Jeremiah, he refuses to be a bystander. He doesn't calculate the political risk.
No, he just acts.
He walks straight out to the city gate where the king is sitting publicly holding court, and he confronts the monarch. He says, "For everyone to hear, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. He is like to die for hunger in the place where he is."
The sheer audacity of that moment.
Oh.
I mean, a foreign servant publicly accusing the most powerful, ruthless men in the government of profound evil right to the king's face. He is risking immediate execution.
But his moral courage acts as a sudden, sharp shock to Zedekiah's paralyzed conscience. The king's spine temporarily stiffens, and he orders Ebedmelech to take 30 men and armed guard to protect against the princes and pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies.
And the specific details of the rescue are incredibly moving.
Yes, I love this part.
Ebedmelech doesn't just run to the cistern with ropes. He goes to a specific storeroom under the treasury and gathers up old, cast-off rags and worn-out, decaying clothes.
Right.
He goes to the edge of the pit, lets these rags down by cords to Jeremiah, and calls out, "Put these old cast clouts and rotten rags under your armpits, under the cords." And then they haul him up out of the mud.
That detail of the rags is so beautiful. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a rescue executed with profound tenderness and empathy. He knew the heavy ropes would dig into the flesh of an elderly, starving man who had been soaking in freezing mud, so he sought out a way to cushion the blow.
If we pull back and analyze this entire sequence, it provides a devastating critique of human hierarchies.
It really does. Look at where the courage originates. The men who possessed all the pedigree, the education, the wealth, and the systemic power the kings and the princes completely folded under peer pressure or resorted to arrogant violence to protect their egos.
But true moral courage, combined with profound compassion, came from the absolute margins of society. Ebedmelech had moral clarity because his identity wasn't tied to the corrupt political system of Judah.
When we look at Jehoiakim burning that scroll, it is so easy to judge him. But we do the exact same thing in our modern lives. The application here is a hard look at how we handle uncomfortable feedback and bad news.
It's tough mirror to look into.
When someone points out a flaw in your business model, a blind spot in your leadership, or a toxic pattern in your marriage, do you act like Jehoiakim? Do you try to cancel the messenger? Do you fire the employee who had the courage to tell you the new product is failing?
Do you cut the friend out of your life because they told you a hard truth you didn't want to hear?
Or, conversely, do you act like Zedekiah? Do you sit in a boardroom or a family meeting knowing perfectly well that the group is making a disastrous or unethical decision, but you stay completely silent because you are paralyzed by the fear of being mocked, marginalized, or losing your social standing?
Do you abdicate your moral responsibility because the king can do nothing against you?
The practice we need to extract from this is a fundamental change in our default response to friction. Ebedmelech shows us that doing the right thing requires risking your social standing.
It always has a cost.
The next time you receive harsh, legitimate feedback, or you realize the truth is unpopular, you have to hit the pause button. Instead of getting defensive and metaphorically reaching for your penknife to cut the uncomfortable data out of your life, write it down. Stare at it objectively.
Accept the reality of the situation, even if it means you have to publicly change course or stand against your peers.
Which is an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when the structures around you are crumbling. Which brings us to the final and perhaps the most deeply personal psychological struggle we see in this deep dive.
Yes.
We have spent a lot of time zooming out to observe the systemic collapse of a nation, the shifting hypocrisy of the masses, and the catastrophic failure of the leadership. But now we need to zoom all the way in.
We need to look at the severe personal psychological toll that all of this takes on an individual who is actually trying to do the right thing in the middle of an apocalypse.
This brings us to the theme of ambition and survival, centered entirely on the scribe Baruch in chapter 45.
Chapter 45 is unique. It is a very brief, highly intimate appendix dedicated entirely to Baruch.
Okay, set this up for us.
Historically, it flashes back slightly to the time when he wrote the scroll that Jehoiakim burned. This chapter gives us a raw, unfiltered window into his mental and emotional state.
And he's not doing well, is he?
He is not a stoic superhero. He is utterly overwhelmed, deeply exhausted, and plunging into despair. We hear his internal monologue. He cries out, "Woe is me now, for the Lord has added grief to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighing, and I find no rest."
It's the ancient equivalent of complete burnout. But why is he so uniquely devastated? Obviously, living in a city under siege by Babylon is objectively terrible for everyone, but Baruch's despair seems deeply personal. It's tied to his identity.
To understand Baruch's pain, you have to understand his pedigree. Biblical commentators and historical context strongly suggest that Baruch was an aristocrat.
Oh, really?
Yes. He came from a highly influential, noble family. His grandfather had been the governor of Jerusalem. His brother was a high-ranking official in the king's court. Baruch was highly educated. He was a master scribe.
So he was on the fast track.
In any normal era of Judah's history, a man with Baruch's background, education, and connections would have been on the absolute fast track to the highest echelons of political and social power. He possessed massive, legitimate career ambitions.
But instead of climbing the ladder of the royal court, he tied his entire life and reputation to Jeremiah, the most hated, politically subversive prophet in the nation.
Exactly. He chose to do the right thing. He acted as the megaphone for a message the government despised.
And the cost was total. Because he associated with Jeremiah, he became an enemy of the state. He had to go into hiding from the king's secret police. He watched his social standing evaporate, his wealth disappear, and his future prospects turn to ash.
Baruch isn't just grieving the imminent loss of his country. He is actively grieving the death of his own ambition. He is mourning the great life he thought he was going to have.
And when he expresses this profound, exhausting sorrow, God gives him a response that is incredibly stark.
It's a hard truth.
It is not a warm, comforting embrace. God doesn't say, "Don't worry, Baruch, I'll make sure you get that promotion eventually."
Not at all. God's response is blunt force trauma to Baruch's worldview. God says through Jeremiah, "Behold, that which I have built will I break down, and that which I have planted I will pluck up, even this whole land. And seekest thou great things for thyself, seek them not. For behold, I will bring evil upon all flesh, but thy life will I give unto thee for a prey in all places whither thou goest."
Seekest thou great things for thyself, seek them not. That is a spectacularly tough pill to swallow when you have spent your life preparing for greatness.
It is the death of ego. God is essentially grabbing Baruch by the shoulders and forcing him to look at the macro reality.
It's just shaking him away.
God is saying, "Look around, Baruch. I am dismantling the architecture of this entire civilization. The institutions are crumbling. The monarchy is ending. This is a season of global collapse. This is absolutely not the time to be upset that you didn't become a cabinet minister. Your ambitions are completely out of scale with the reality of this moment. Survival is the only victory available."
To really drive home why Baruch's lingering ambitions for high office were so utterly futile, we have to look at what actually happens to the people who held those offices.
We have to look at the brutal historical reality detailed in chapter 39, the actual fall of Jerusalem.
It wasn't just a peaceful transition of municipal management, it was an absolute bloodbath.
The historical accounts in chapter 39 are horrific. After 18 months of starvation, the Babylonian siege engines finally breach the city walls. Chaos erupts.
And Zedekiah?
King Zedekiah, the paralyzed coward we analyzed earlier, attempts to abandon his people and flee the city under the cover of darkness with his royal guard. But the Babylonian army pursues them and captures Zedekiah on the plains of Jericho. They drag him before Nebuchadnezzar.
And Nebuchadnezzar's punishment is designed for maximum psychological destruction.
It is barbarous. They execute Zedekiah's young sons right in front of him. They slaughter all the nobles and the powerful princes of Judah, the very men who had thrown Jeremiah into the mud.
Wow.
And then, having forced Zedekiah to watch the murder of his children, the Babylonians gouge out Zedekiah's eyes.
The death of his children was the very last thing he ever saw.
He is then bound in heavy bronze chains and dragged hundreds of miles to Babylon, where he will die in dungeon. The city of Jerusalem is then systematically burned to the ground. The great walls are dismantled stone by stone. The temple is destroyed.
The whole society is just gone.
The remaining population is rounded up and forced into a death march of exile. Everything that constituted great things in that society was entirely obliterated.
But in the very midst of this apocalyptic ruin, the text explicitly notes that two specific individuals are spared.
Yes. Remember Ebedmelech, the brave Ethiopian eunuch?
Yeah.
God sends a specific message to him, promising that when the city falls, he will not be handed over to the Babylonians to be killed, specifically because he put his trust in God rather than the political system. He is protected.
And Baruch.
And Baruch, the exhausted scribe, along with Jeremiah, survives. As God promised, Baruch is given his life as a prey, a military term, meaning he gets to walk away with his life as his only prize of war. He walks out of the smoldering ruins of his ambitions, alive.
This philosophy of survival really echoes later Stoic thought, doesn't it?
It really does.
You read Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, and you find this intense focus on detaching your self-worth and your internal peace from external, uncontrollable outcomes. The Stoics tell you to focus entirely on what is within your control, your virtue, and let the empire do what it will.
The parallel is very strong. The Stoics rightly observe that you cannot control the macroeconomic cycles, the whims of an emperor, or the invading armies, so you must find your victory in your internal resilience.
But there's a difference here, right?
Yes, we must be careful to distinguish the underlying mechanism here. The biblical text places this surrender of ambition squarely within the context of trusting divine providence, not merely relying on internal muscular mental fortitude.
Oh, okay.
Baruch isn't told to just tough it out using his own willpower. He is commanded to stop striving for worldly greatness because God is actively managing the macro collapse. He is told to trust that God sees him and will personally ensure his survival through the fire.
It is the active surrender of ego, combined with a profound trust in the protector. Now let's translate this into the 21st century, because this message cuts completely against the grain of our modern culture.
Completely against the grain.
We live in a society that is absolutely obsessed with seeking great things. We are drowning in hustle culture, podcasts about maximizing your potential, the obsession with being on 30 under 30 lists, and the constant pressure to optimize every second of your life for higher yield.
And let's be clear. In times of relative peace, stability, and economic growth, ambition can be a wonderful creative engine for progress. It drives innovation. But in times of severe crisis, whether that is a global macroeconomic downturn, a pandemic, or a deeply personal trauma like a devastating cancer diagnosis, the sudden death of a spouse, or a messy, life-altering divorce, that exact same ambition can become a weapon we use against ourselves.
Oh, that's so true.
We often punish ourselves for not achieving great things when we are standing in the middle of the wreckage. We suffer from massive compounding burnout because we stubbornly refuse to adjust our expectations to our new traumatic reality.
I see this constantly. You talk to people who are going through the absolute hardest, most destabilizing season of their entire life, and instead of giving themselves grace, they are beating themselves up because they didn't use the time to learn a new language, write a novel, or start side hustle.
Exactly.
Their house is metaphorically burning down, and they are stressed out because they aren't efficiently rearranging the living room furniture.
And that is why God's stark word to Baruch, "Seekest thou great things for thyself, seek them not," is actually a word of immense, profound grace for anyone currently navigating a season of collapse.
It is divine permission to stop striving for greatness when your only real job is to survive.
So the practical application for you, the listener, right now is about fundamentally redefining what a win looks like in your current season of life.
Take a hard look at your circumstances. If you are going through a crisis right now, whether it is a brutal professional transition, a health emergency, or a season of severe anxiety, you need to give yourself permission to stop seeking great things. You need to radically adjust your metrics for success.
Accept the fact that simply getting through the day with your integrity intact, being kind to your kids, showing up for your partner, and maintaining your core values, that is enough.
In a season of ruin, walking away with your life, your character, and your soul as a prize is the ultimate victory. You don't need a promotion. You just need to stand firm.
This entire block of text, chapters 34 through 45, is a sweeping, devastating, and incredibly precise examination of human nature under the ultimate pressure test. We have watched how systems and individuals fail and how a rare few succeed.
We have covered an immense amount of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
We've dissected the cynical economic hypocrisy of the elite freeing and re-enslaving their servants. We've watched the fear-driven manipulation of Yohanan asking for guidance he never intended to follow.
We've contrasted the unyielding generational discipline of the nomadic Rechabites with the absolute historical delusion of the idolaters in Egypt clinging to the Queen of Heaven.
We witness the staggering arrogance of Jehoiakim using a penknife to try and edit divine reality, and the pathetic, muddy cowardice of Zedekiah abdicating his power to the mob.
We saw the quiet, socially dangerous courage of Ebedmelech the Ethiopian, and finally we sat with the exhausted, necessary surrender of Baruch's worldly ambitions.
It forces us to ask very hard questions about what we rely on when the pressure inevitably comes to our own lives.
It does. It exposes what we're really made of.
And as we wrap up, it leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought that I want you, the listener, to mull over on your own time. When the dust finally settles in chapter 39 and you look out over the smoking, blood-soaked ashes of Jerusalem, the text leaves us with a stark, undeniable reality regarding human security. Think about who survived and who perished.
It's the ultimate paradox.
The people who seemingly had absolutely everything, the kings with their armies, the princes with their political influence, the wealthy elites who compromised every moral principle they had just to protect their status and their grain silos, they lost everything.
Their wealth made them targets.
Their political maneuvering ended in their execution or in being dragged into exile in bronze chains. But look at who walked away, the outcasts. The nomadic Rechabites who refused to build houses or accumulate wealth were perfectly positioned to survive the collapse of the real estate. Ebedmelech, the Ethiopian eunuch who had zero political power to lose and operated entirely on moral clarity, was divinely protected. Baruch, the lowly, exhausted scribe who was forced to abandon his dreams of climbing the social ladder, walked away with his life.
They survived because they were unattached to the system that fell.
What if our modern, relentless obsession with security, with accumulating status, with building our own little invulnerable kingdoms, and compromising our values to protect our comfort, what if that is actually the very thing making us incredibly fragile?
What if the things we think are protecting us are actually the chains that will drag us down when the system shakes?
And what if true resilience, true anti-fragility, is found not in the center of power and wealth, but by living on the margins of the world's expectations, tethered only to objective truth and unwavering integrity? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.